evening, and thank you for attending what promises to be a compelling event. I'm Will Ruger, the Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute, and a former resident of Wimberley, Texas. That's right. We're excited about tonight's program. Criminal justice reform is an important issue that affects the well-being of so many people. And we're honored to have an impressive lineup of panelists to speak about it. Many people aren't aware yet that CKI has embarked on a well-being initiative that seeks to improve our quality of life through research and dialogue. Tonight's event is part of that initiative, and we hope it will help advance solutions to a problem that many states, including Texas, are tackling. Before we begin, let me start by asking, how many of you would consider yourselves to be law-abiding citizens? I hope everyone.
That's
Right. Well, most of us think we follow the law, but it might surprise you to know that it's very likely you have done something illegal even if you didn't realize it. This is in part due to the incredible expansion of the U.S. Criminal Code. In fact, there are over 4,500 federal criminal laws and 30,000 federal criminal regulations that are on the books. Many of these laws are written so that you do not have to knowingly and willfully commit the wrongful act. If you just commit an act, then you leave yourself open to criminal prosecution, conviction, and imprisonment. This doesn't even count state laws. Texas, unfortunately, is no stranger to the problem. According to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which, by the way, does such great work on this and other areas, I would be remiss if I didn't say that. But according to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the Lone Star State has more than 1,700 criminal laws, including 11 felonies related to oyster harvesting alone. Unbelievable, right? And again, that's felonies. Now, the impact of a criminal conviction on individuals' well-being, even if it's just a minor offense, is immense, especially given the problem of extreme sentencing. A lifelong penalty to those with a record includes time spent in jail rather than on something rehabilitative or productive, limited job opportunities, and fractures to their support networks, whether it's family, coworkers, or friends. The cost to families and communities can be devastating. Families often are strained financially and emotionally when a parent is incarcerated. According to the Pew Charitable Trust, nearly 3 million children in the U.S. are forced to live without at least one parent due to criminal convictions, often for nonviolent offenses. Research also shows that children without fathers have a higher chance of spending time behind bars than their peers and reduced economic mobility. Many researchers, government officials, and members of the law enforcement community know the system isn't working, and they're looking for solutions. Texas is often held up as an example of how states can enact reform. A state often known for being tough on crime is taking a smart on crime approach, as Governor Perry recently put it. Successful initiatives have sought to reintegrate former prisoners back into society, prevent recidivism, and reduce the prison population. That's why the Charles Koch Institute has chosen Austin as the venue for a forum exploring this topic, and we hope advancing reforms. Given our focus on improving well-being, overcriminalization and the considerable impact it has on people and their families is certainly an area that we believe merits serious discussion. And we believe that by bringing experts together with different experiences, perspectives, and backgrounds, that solutions to this critical problem can be reached. And we're excited to hear from our distinguished panel, so now I'll turn it over to Andrew Carell. But thank you very much.
And thank you. On behalf of media, I just want to thank CKI for doing this again. This is the second time we've done an event with them, and we hope to be as thought-provoking as the last, if not more. Let me introduce our panel. So to my left, we have Norman Reamer, who is the
Executive Director
of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. To his left, we have Mark Levin, who, is the Director of the Center of Effective Justice and Right on Crime, which are both housed at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And then to his left, we have Bernard Carrick, who is the former Commissioner of the New York Police Department. And then to his left, we have Gary Bledsoe, who is the president of the Texas branch of the NAACP. So before we get started, I just wanted to say that this issue is, at its core, it's a human interest story. Beyond just policy, it's a human interest story. That's how, at least how I view it. And so that's why I want to start with Commissioner Carrick, because you've sort of lived this. I mean, you were, and anybody who lives in New York, when they think Bernard Carrick, they think hard on crime. They think Giuliani's man. You were credited with reducing crime during your tenure. And then you had an experience, and now you are a criminal justice reformer. So tell us about that.
I was the New York City Police Commissioner. Before that, I was a cop. I was a correctional officer. I was the warden of the county jail. I ran Rikers Island in the New York City jail system from 1995 to 2000. In 2000, I became the New York City Police Commissioner in charge of 55,000 New York City police officers and civilians, responsible for the safety and security of the city. I later became the interim minister of the Interior of Iraq for President Bush. I was nominated for Homeland Security Secretary in 2004, and as a result of a nanny that my wife and I had that we did not pay tax on, I declined the position, underwent state and federal investigations that lasted more than 5 years, and eventually I pled guilty to 8 felonies and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. And
How did it change your, I mean, what was sort of the aha for you?
If I had to sum it up in a short sentence, I put many people in prison, many. I oversaw one of the most substantial drug investigations in U.S. history. These were bad people that did bad things. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years of life. They tried to kill me. They killed men I worked with. I seized tons of cocaine from them, millions in drug proceeds. I don't have any problem, as I sit up here today, to the people I put in prison when I was a drug agent. But then I went to federal prison. And I remember one of the first young black men that I met from Baltimore, when I asked him how much time he had, what he had been sentenced to. I was told 10 years. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for 5 grams of cocaine, which is about the weight, probably, of the top of this container. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for 5 grams of cocaine in a conspiracy. And I was sickened by it, because all I could think of, after being there for a month, we're going to keep this kid in prison for 8.5 years. He's not going to learn anything except how to steal, cheat, lie, manipulate, gamble, con, and fight. And then we're going to let him out, and we're going to send him back into society. And by some delusion, somebody in the Congress, somebody that creates these sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimums, they think that that's better for society. I disagree. I don't think it's better for society. I think it destroys society. I think it destroys families. And my mindset on a number of things in the system changed. The longer I was in prison, and I spent 3 years and 11 days in a federal minimum security camp, the longer I was there, the more I learned about the system, and the more I realized that it is in dire need of repair.
And you sort of alluded to something, I'm going to go to Gary Bledsoe next. You sort of alluded to something that is sort of the elephant in the room. People don't like to talk about it, is the racial disparity. I mean, a lot of what's often, Will mentioned it in his remarks, but there is clearly a disparity in how the criminal justice system treats, especially black Americans compared to everybody else. And I mean, why is that?
Well, the bottom line is, in these urban areas where drugs are a way of life, when you take those young people, look, you can get arrested for 5 grams of cocaine on a state charge, and it could be reduced from it may not even be a felony, but then it could get reduced from a felony to a misdemeanor. You could get probation. In New York City, you may get 60 days, you may get 6 months in the county facility. But in the federal system, it could be 10 years, it could be 15, it could be 20, tacked onto a conspiracy. I'm no mathematician and I'm no mathematical genius, but I can tell you this, if you looked at, and Gary will understand this probably better than anyone, if you look at the statistical rate that we have incarcerated black men for the last 30 years, and you look at 30 years from today, if we continue that rate, I believe 70 to 75% of every black man in this country is going to either be in prison or under the judicial thumb of some parole or probation. It's unsustainable. It can't continue. You have to stop it.
What do you say about that, Gary?
Well, I think Bernie's clearly correct. I think it's an enormous problem. I think we have to look at history to begin with to really understand the problem. I think that what occurred is many, many years ago, because of things that were evolving in this country, there was a national campaign undertaken by the South to convince individuals about the inferiority of African Americans and about the criminal disposition, and that led to many other things, such as the convict leasing program that was basically slavery by another name. I think many of you might have seen the book, Doug Blackman, Slavery by Another Name, incredible book. But I think they go into detailing the reasons and some of the economics behind the prison system and wanting to get more people in there to provide free labor for a number of nefarious reasons. So those things provided a true underpinning for why there was an incentive to put people into prison. But one of the things that Blackman talks about in his book is that all around the nation, really, particularly in the South, a culture was created where individuals were convicted of crimes they had not committed, and that they were knowingly convicted of those crimes, and that it became such a big industry that these became like commodities, and there were individuals who were going around and buying the paper for which people were convicted, and this even occurred in Texas. So I think it's somewhat of a truly tragic situation. I know that is now moved into what's occurring today, even with the idea about trying to privatize what's happening in the correctional industry. And I think that's a real problem that we have to look at and try to avoid, because I think that's a bad thing and something we should not undertake. But I think we started looking at the studies that have been done, and all of the independent individuals who don't have a political agenda, who've looked at this issue, have all come up with conclusions that at whatever aspect of the system they looked at, that there was some problem with either treatment that led to a discriminatory result or some kind of intentional discrimination behind the result that ended. And so we can look at either whether it's Tony Fabello studying the Texas system, showing that whether it's the likelihood of arrest, the likelihood of a conviction, the likelihood of a lengthier sentence, the likelihood of having your paper revoked, your parole, or your probation. There's a racial dynamic to that. We can look at the Texas Appleseed Group and the Department of Education recently and what they've done with the school-to-prison pipeline. And I think what the Department of Education has even done, which is truly incredible to me, they looked at preschool programs and found out that African-American preschoolers were much more likely to be expelled from a preschool program, like 18% of preschoolers being African-American, but 48% of those assigned to out-of-school suspension being African-American. So, and I think I can go on and talk about one study or another, but I think that what's occurring is it's very clear. There's a system that is about to envelop all of the African-American male population. I think Chief Carrick is really correct 100%. And I think it's a bad thing, and it's something that we need to address. And there are different reasons for different people to want to address the problem. I think it's wrong. I think it's discrimination. I think that the system needs to be changed to be more respectful. I know on the national level There's legislation such as the Smarter Sentencing Act, the End Racial Profiling Act, that are now at Congress, and one that would address it in the juvenile arena as well. So I think we need to look at supporting those, but I think that also on the state level, we need to try to do things. I've been so glad to work with, Mark Levin and Anianes Correa here in Texas, and have had some success. Things are getting more difficult in Texas, though, and maybe even more difficult this time, but I'm glad to see the debate is getting broader, because I think there are other social reasons. And the one aspect that I didn't mention, besides the wrongness of the policy, is the financials behind it. When we look at the enormous amount of money that's spent to incarcerate an individual, I think it's absurd. I think it really adds to tax expenses that don't need to be added to. And we had done studies. I know that years ago we'd gotten Dr. Dwight Stewart to do a study for us, and Anna would probably remember that. And we were able to have some real success at the legislature, not as much as we wanted, but we were able to show that if you just briefly change the policy about how long you retain someone in the Department of Corrections, that you would probably reduce just by 6 months, average per prisoner. You save the state, I forget how many hundreds of millions of dollars, but it was like $200 million a year or something. It was a pretty incredible sum. And so I think we need to be smart and need to look at the numbers to see where we might go, and look at some judges, like I know Judge Vanessa Gilmore in Houston, United States District Judge, is doing some really incredible and great things there, because she recognizes the families and the whole family aspect that's here. Because every time that you send someone to prison, you maybe lose an income learner, lose someone that is going to be able to help guide the children. It's going to be a stigma placed on the child and all kinds of things that they'll have to deal with. And I think that there's 7.3 million American children that have at least one parent that's incarcerated, and it's expected that 70% of them will follow suit with their parents. And so that's a problem that we've identified, we see, and we need to do whatever we can to try to stop that from continuing.
So we'll talk about that a little more too. I want to go to Norman Reamer now, though. I sort of want to lay the groundwork before we start to get into solutions and all the nitty-gritty. One of the other things we haven't talked about yet is collateral consequences. Your group has done a lot of work on this. Right. The idea that when you're convicted of a crime, there are things that you no longer have the right to do.
Right. That's correct. So let me discuss some numbers with you. Okay. We start with the problem of mass incarceration in this country. That's a core problem. Okay. We have roughly 2.1 million people in jail right now in this country. We have more people in jail in the United States, both in absolute numbers and per capita, than any other country on the planet. So it raises the question, are we a nation of bad people? I don't think we are. I think we are a nation that has made some bad choices, and we have gotten intoxicated on the use of our criminal justice system to regulate virtually every aspect of personal, social, and economic behavior. Now, yeah, I like applause. But I wish we could turn it around. But that really is only the first number when we want to look at the state of well-being in our society. There are two other numbers to keep in mind. One of them is 45,000. That's how many collateral consequences there are. That, as a result of a study done by the American Bar Association under a grant from NIJ, they're still counting, and they have found 45,000 of these collateral consequences. That's astonishing. These are penalties that are imposed not as a result of the request of a prosecutor and not pronounced by a judge at sentence. They are buried in both the federal and the state laws. They're at the state level, they're at the county level, they're at the municipal level, and they inflict people who have a brush with the criminal system with lifelong altering debarments, disabilities. It affects where you can live. It affects your right to housing. It affects your right to student loans. It affects the immigration status of even lawful residents who are here legally, played by the rules. They can be deported as a result of a conviction. It affects every realm of family rights. It affects virtually every occupation you can think of is affected by this.
What are some examples of things that, some of these collateral consequences?
Collateral consequences are not being able to be in public housing. I'll give you some. NACDL has just completed a 3-year study, and we're about to release a report called Collateral Damage, America's Failure to Forgive and Forget in the War on Crime. And it lays out a blueprint for the restoration of rights. And we took testimony across the country over 3 years from over 150 witnesses, from every player in the justice system, from people who've been through the system, unfortunately, like Commissioner Carrick, from people who work in probation and parole. And we have gotten the human face of this. And I'll give you some examples, okay? A mother of 4 who's dismissed from a job at a bank because of a shoplifting arrest that didn't even result in a conviction. A 75-year-old man who is thrown out of public housing and put on a sexual registry list because of one incidence of public urination. A decorated veteran of one of our wars who was deported, notwithstanding the fact that he was a permanent resident, had served his country with distinction, and had 1 misdemeanor conviction. This is the face of collateral consequences, and we have to, when we talk about solutions, we have to, as a country, come to grips with this, because economically, morally, it is wrong. It is depleting the resources of this country. We cannot allow people, because they have had a brush with the criminal justice system, to be permanently put into second-class status.
Now, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Those examples may be outliers. I mean, don't a lot of people, there are violent people who deserve to have some rights stripped.
If somebody is convicted of a violent crime, the chances are they're going to go away for a very long time. But you can't paint with a broad brush. Let me pick up on something Gary said. The single most common crimes that result in jail and in convictions, first of all, the most common crime is driving without a license in this country, by the way. We did a study of that. And that's not because people have been lost their license necessarily because they were reckless drivers. That's a penalty that's imposed for all kinds of things that people do. But beyond that, it's drugs, okay? In 2010, we had 1.7 million drug arrests in this country. Half of them were for marijuana, and the overwhelming majority of that half was for simple possession. But we know from studies that the use of marijuana is the same in the white community, in the Hispanic community, in the African American community, but we are arresting people in the African American community at 3.7 times the rate that we're arresting people in the white community. So I don't want to hear about outliers, and I don't want to hear about, there's this certain situation with a sexual predator. Yeah, of course, you can have that for a sexual predator. But when it's a 19-year-old who had sex with a 16-year-old, do you really want that person registering for the rest of their life? Or the example I gave? The problem is, and I'll wrap it up with this, the problem is that we can't control our legislatures. We can't stop them. Right here in Texas, a year ago, I was privileged to be invited by the Texas Public Policy Foundation to do a presentation on overcriminalization at the start of the legislative session. And there was a wonderful presentation by Representative Bill Caligari, I believe, who spoke about Texas's infatuation with the regulation of occupation. Well, I will tell you that since I was here last January, in the last session, in the 2013 session of the legislature, the Texas legislature enacted 22 new collateral consequences, barring people from various occupations, and 26 additional ones through regulation. This includes landscaping, architects, interior design. You can't even be an inspector in a vehicle inspection station as a result of the actions of the last legislature. This is a problem which knows no bounds. It is neither a Democratic nor a Republican problem. It is not a blue state, red state. It is not conservative or liberal. It is a national hunger for the use of the criminal justice system and penalties that we as a country have got to come to grips with.
After that stirring.
Well, Thomas Jefferson said the natural tendency is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. Right. And that's just what you described. And so we have to push back against that, and we have been. And obviously those occupations you mentioned were already licensed in Texas, and then what happens is it creates its own constituency. And so those who have those licenses already want to have every rule and law passed to keep new people out. And of course, if you constrain supply, you increase wages, so it's better for those people. It's a classic economic problem. So, but I want to step back a little bit on the well-being aspect of this, just to say, I think when we look at criminal justice, we have to say where are the touchstones as far as well-being is concerned. And one of them is obviously we just had Crime Victims' Rights Week. Certainly crime has, particularly property and of course most of all violent crime, a negative impact, most certainly on the individual victim, but also when you have whole neighborhoods that are living in fear and so forth. But then when we do sanctions in response to those crimes that actually make things worse, we add on to that. And one of the things we've tried to really say from the very beginning is, if I steal from you, the government isn't the victim, society isn't the victim, you're the victim. And so we need to move towards approaches like victim offender mediation, where you basically don't need government except to enforce the agreement that's reached through the mediation. So the way it works is basically, let's say I stole from you, and again, this is with your request, and the defendant has to consent too because they're waiving the right to trial and such, but we sit down and work out an agreement with a mediator for restitution, community service, etc. This happens far more quickly than the criminal justice traditional process, and the data shows much more likely for the victim to get restitution, much more likely to say they're satisfied. And you know, we use a lot of statistics in the criminal justice system, but I think at the end of the day, these are human interactions, and one of the things we've found from studies interviewing victims is the thing they want most of all, often in addition to restitution, is an apology. And only the offender can provide that. They also want an assurance that that person's not going to steal from someone else. And of course, I guess you could put them in prison for life without parole, but realistically, for a kid in my neighborhood, a 10-year-old who steals something out of my garage, we're not going to incarcerate him. But we want him to understand that he didn't just violate the words of a statute on a sheet of paper, he harmed another individual. And by sitting across from that individual and hearing how that individual was harmed, it, in most people, awakens their conscience. And so that's why I think these approaches have proven to reduce recidivism. So again, you know, the big picture is the stronger families are and the stronger informal controls are, the less government you need. And once we do have a violation of another person's rights by stealing from them or committing a violent crime, then we need to look at the way where government can be least involved in simply enforcing a resolution of it that's satisfactory to the victim.
And what about nonviolent offenses? I mean, you're talking about, there's victims, but what about where there is no victim but it's a crime? I mean, how do you, how does the justice system waste, as I would think you've done a lot on this, how it wastes a lot of money on especially nonviolent convictions? I mean, what is the cure for that?
Well, I think what you're getting at is crimes like drugs and prostitution, where
also there's a lot of fraud. Well, there's victim in fraud, but white collar kind of stuff.
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely restitution's critical in those cases too. I mean, certainly I would say in a case like Bernard Madoff or something like that, he was entirely correct that he needed to go to prison. I think that but most property crimes are nothing of that magnitude. And again, I think victims should have the option to be able to request mediation, and they don't currently. And unfortunately, in my view, it's the prosecutors that are driving the entire train. And I mean, there's many great prosecutors, but the prosecutors will tell you, even if the victim wants restitution for, if I do a 10-year-old steals from my garage, the prosecutors will want to say no. They want to have the authority to veto that. And I think we need to go back to looking at it not as this phrase that, owing a debt to society is entirely wrong-headed. It's owing a debt to the person that you harmed.
Right. So it's more of an interpersonal solution that you're sort of advocating. Restorative justice is what you call it. Right?
Yes, but I do think there also is, to some degree, a neighborhood component of this too. In fact, there have been successful mediations between high school gangs and things like that. So there is certainly an effect if somebody breaks into my home and my neighbors then are in fear. So there is a role to bring community members. In Vermont, they have these restorative sentencing centers, and they have basically sentencing circles where people sit around, the volunteers from the community, and decide there's 14 of these centers. And it's kind of like they do on Indian reservations, pass around a baton, and everybody talks about how this affected the community. And then they reach again, it's not sending people to jail, but it's a sanctions and restitution community service that tries to restore the victim in the community.
People would say, that's Vermont. I can see that being a response to that. That's Vermont. You kind of can see that sitting around, having restorative sort of conversations like that. But is that something you can apply to greater, like perhaps large urban areas, or on the federal level?
Well, I think that we've actually been studying the mediation program in Lubbock, which is doing thousands of cases every year, incredibly successful. I think the victim offender mediation, where you can have an attorney or a volunteer as a mediator or minister, that's a bit easier to scale than the sentencing circles in a rural community in Vermont. So I do think you do have to take that into account. But as far as the overcriminalization goes, I did want to briefly touch on that. I mean, one of the biggest problems is the erosion of mens rea. Where you no longer have to prove a culpable mental state in many instances to convict somebody. And the example we give, I think, that helps illustrate it is the drug laws in Florida. The legislature there actually said no culpable mental states required for conviction. So that means if you rent a car at Hertz and there were drugs where the spare tire is supposed to be and you're pulled over for speeding and a dog sniffs those, you're going to prison for a mandatory minimum for 10 or 15 years if a prosecutor chooses to bring that case. And, you know, that kind of goes back to how this growth in the number of criminal laws truly gives the government the authority to make a charge against anyone. The head of the secret police under Stalin said, "Bring me the man, I'll find the crime." And that's where we're at.
So that reminds me, one big component of this is, it is at its heart, there is a little bit of regulatory aspect to this. There's a civil liberties lawyer out of Boston named Harvey Silverglade who said something like, he actually wrote a book about it, where he said that, if he were to follow any individual, any average American, follow them for a day of going about their business, he could find at least 3 felonies that they've committed. So at its heart, I mean, there is this question of, are we an perhaps overregulated or overcriminalized nation? I mean, there are, Bernie, Commissioner Carrick, you say that there were people that you served in jail with that did all sorts of crimes that were not, that would seem kind of absurd.
Well, I was probably 60–70% of the men I was with in the minimum security camp were there for drug crimes, but there were other men there, and some men enhanced their income on a mortgage application. It's done 95% of the time in this country. If you're targeted, you'll go to prison. There's so many things that a young man, a 21-year-old United States Marine sniper, he sold a pair of his own personal night vision goggles on eBay. He went to prison for 3 years. It's commercial fishermen that caught too many fish. Many of them. There were many of them.
Somebody who sold something on eBay was another one?
Things they sold on eBay. But the thing about some of these, and especially the commercial fishermen, the problem is you take a man 55, 65 years old. That's all he's done. One of these men I knew personally, I met and became friends with. He had been fishing since he was 17 years old. It's all he knew. They put him in prison for 18 months. He served his time, but then he can't fish ever again. They took his license. He lost his company. His wife lost her house. His family was destroyed. His life was destroyed. Where's he going to go? The collateral cost of that conviction was mind-boggling and devastating. And I got to back up 1 second, because Norm talked about Congress failing to do its job and the legislators. And Gary mentioned wrongful convictions. And I want the viewers and I want the people in this audience to think about this when it comes to wrongful convictions and our criminal justice system today. Last year, there were several reports that came out, but one of which that it talked about wrongful convictions, and it talked about, over the past 15 years, nearly 1,000 people were convicted wrongfully and sentenced to nearly 10,000 years in prison. Think about that number. 1,000 people sentenced to 10,000 years in prison. And I ask you, today, we have congressional hearings on the Nielsen rating system to see how well it works. We have congressional hearings when Secret Service agents go into a foreign country and party. We have congressional hearings on sports players that take performance-enhancing drugs. Why are we not having congressional hearings on this system and what's wrong with it? Why aren't we having congressional hearings to determine why those wrongful convictions happen and why we are depriving American citizens from their freedom wrongfully, illegally. Our congressional leaders have got to stop this mindset that they're scared to death to act because they feel like they're soft on crime. It's got to stop. They've got to be smart on crime. They've got to be aggressive on change and aggressive on reform.
And Norm, you were trying to, I saw you wanted to add something to this.
Well, I think one thing I think the viewers should also know, which is far be it from me ever to come to the defense of the legislators in the country, but we are pleased that there's a small, little, not well-known thing going on in the House of Representatives. And the House Judiciary Committee has a bipartisan task force on overcriminalization. And they've been looking at a number of these aspects. They had 6 hearings last year. They've had 1 so far this year, and I think they're going to have several more. I think they may even look at penalties. They may look, I'm hoping that they're going to look at the question of collateral consequences. So I think there's a ray of hope there, but we've got a long way to go. We really have, this is the thing, we have to be smart and constructive about changing the dialogue. And, you know, this is one of those things where the people have to lead. You know, the politicians are going to have to come to this reluctantly, but that people can lead on this, because this is not, what we've done to ourselves is not good for our country. It's just not good for the well-being of our society in any way, shape, or form to have these classes of people. And I was also nodding at Commissioner Carrick's comment about the fishermen. This is the thing that is so really tragic about these collateral consequences that we have. There's no rational basis for a lot of them. Some of them are mandatory. Now, why should you mandatorily lose your right to vote or lose your right to bear arms if the crime had nothing to do with, you're not a danger. If it was a crime, if you stole from somebody, you paid your debt to society, why shouldn't you have your rights back? This is the thing that we have to do. We have to come to grips with it, because what we're doing is we're cutting off opportunity and we're costing ourselves. And I'll just give you one other important consideration, especially when it comes to employment. We know that recidivism is directly related to whether or not a person gets a job. We know that if a person gets a job, the chances of them going back into criminal activity drops precipitously. We also know that if a person, there have been studies done on this, if a person goes 3.8 years without being rearrested, the risk that they will ever be rearrested again is the same as the general population. We've got to give people opportunity to get back to work. And the last point I'll make on that is to bear in mind that so much of this focuses on youth. So much of these arrests, so much of this crime is by young people. We know from studies that the mind isn't, the higher levels of the mind, the functioning of the mind, aren't even developed until people are 25 years old. I'm not arguing about holding them criminally responsible over a certain age, though I take great exception to holding children criminally responsible. But even if you do, you've got to look at the fact that people change and they grow and they mature, and you've got to give them hope.
Before we continue, I just wanted to note for those watching at home, when we take questions at the end, we might take questions from Twitter. So if you use the hashtag Justice Reform, I didn't mention that earlier, but you can submit your questions to us. This is for anybody who wants to take it. It seems like a lot of all 4 of you said things that are very simple. It seems like it's a no-brainer to want to reform, whether it's the racial aspect, whether it's the over-regulatory aspect, whether it's restorative justice. But like, what are the forces at work? And I'm sure you all have a different take on this, actually. So let me start at the end, actually. I mean, what are the forces at work that are preventing this? Because it doesn't seem like there's anybody who's saying, no, we got to keep criminalizing everything. I mean, what?
There are huge forces, and let me mention to start out. I think one of the things that's at work, and I think many of us have felt the impact of this, is it's good politics to be hard on crime. Right. It's good politics to be extreme on race. And whether we like that or not, I know here in Texas, I know Mark and Anna would tell you that we've lost some very good legislators who have either lost or who have not run for re-election because they could read the tea leaves. And issues such as being smart on crime are not good politics. And So that intimidates other people in the legislature when they see these things happening to their colleagues who only did the right thing. And so we have to understand that unless we come together, those on the left and those on the right, and say we need to be smart and take this issue out of the political dynamic, we're going to continue to have problems. They have had hearings, but I think what the chief is talking about is having a different kind of, more visible, the kind of hearing that really draws the nation's attention to the problem because it's a horrendous situation. So that's number one. Number two, I think one of the problems that we have is simply that many of our public officials are just not sensitive to the issue when they are empowered. I'll give you one quick example. Had a case, an individual had revocations in Travis County and in another county. And the judge in Travis County understood the issues, wanted to extend their probation and allow them to continue to live. They had a family. The family was going to be harmed by the person going to jail. The complainant said that I really made a false complaint. But the other county went ahead and moved forward anyway and revoked the probation even under those circumstances. So it was without regard to the person losing the business, without regard to the children that were going to be without a father. It was just cold. And I think we've got to say that that's not the appropriate thing. Yeah, no one wants to be in a neighborhood where there's crime. Okay, I've been victimized by crime like all of you might have been. And so we're not encouraging anyone to engage in criminal activity. But we need to be smart about the ideas that we allow to go forward. Because what happens is, with this frenzy, the other part of it being difficult for legislators to do things and to be able to stand up for those is that we have legislators who want to make a mark. And they make a mark by demagoguing issues. And you look at whether you can't get public housing now. You can't, Leonard will tell you can't qualify for student loans. So once you've done your time, you want to improve your life, you're ineligible for loans to improve your life. We know in many states, like Texas, private entities can say, we don't want to lease an apartment to anyone that has a record. So, it goes on and on and on to where you do put them in terms of being a second-class citizen. So how can you ever rehab and get back to where you want? So the system promotes people going back into the system and creating problems. And I know one of the big lawsuit now that actually the Texas Attorney General has brought to go after the EOC, where the EOC tried to put a curb on the use of criminal background checks, where these are being used to disadvantage people unnecessarily and prevent them from being able to have an opportunity in life. And so, the Attorney General has filed a lawsuit saying no, that it's inappropriate for you to give guidelines to suggest people how they can smartly use criminal convictions, because that's been a huge problem for people. I look at some companies, I think, I will shout out to Walmart. We know they have a program where they do hire people that have the criminal conviction, but we need to have some things like that happen to make it for a situation where people can get back into society and not have this terrible stigma on them, or else they're going to continue to have the type problem that we don't want them to have.
And so we're going to run short of time, but I want another aspect. I think another sort of force that may be at work here, and I think this may be up your wheelhouse, is the budgetary aspect, the sort of self-perpetuating motion of that is the regulatory state. I mean, people, not even the regulatory state, the criminal justice system is going to continue to want to keep itself employed. So there's no person saying let's keep criminalizing everything. It's just people's jobs depend on having all this mechanism.
Yeah, well, Gary identifies some valid points, but there has been a lot of change. We did a poll several months ago in Texas of 1,000 likely voters on these very issues, and found off the chart 70-80% support for alternatives to incarceration, for reducing the number of nonviolent offenders in prison, drug courts, all sorts of alternatives. And so, and Tea Party identified voters were among the strongest supporters. And just in the microcosm, there was a DA race in the Republican Republican primary in Hayes County, a conservative county just up the road, and the two candidates in the Republican primary were fighting over who was more pro-drug court, who was going to use cite and summons. I mean, it was really impressive. So there has been a lot of change, but I think that it is a vulnerable issue to a bumper sticker or a 30-second radio ad. You can't deny that. But I do think the public is gaining a more nuanced understanding of these issues. To answer your question, absolutely. I mean, these agencies that license occupations, they wouldn't exist but for the revenue they generate. And the more people that are licensed, the more money they get. You can also look at it in the probation system. People on probation, they pay over half the cost of probation, which, by the way, is $3.75 a day versus $50 a day in Texas prisons. But half that cost, more than half now, is paid by probationers. Now, I think that's appropriate. But on the other hand, what happens is they don't want to early terminate exemplary probationers after years of being in compliance and posing no risk to the public because they'll lose the money. Because those are the same guys that are paying their fees and they don't need any supervision. So they need those guys to kind of cross-subsidize the people that are shaky on paying their fees, many times because they can't get a job, as the things we discussed. So I think we need to look at maybe having any revenues that come in just go into the general treasury. I don't think we should necessarily. I think it's fine that people pay, if they're able, some cost of their supervision, but that shouldn't just be the probation department so dependent on that revenue that creates an incentive to keep these people on longer than necessary.
So I want to start, we want to get to audience questions in a second, but before we do, I just want to ask Commissioner Carrick one last question. So given all you know, I mean, now that you're a criminal justice reformer, would you, say go back to 2000 and you were Commissioner Carrick now again in 2000, would you have done things differently? I mean, Rudy Giuliani credited you with reducing crime during your tenure. You were known as a successful commissioner, but would you change how you ran the city's police department?
No, I wouldn't. I think people have to be held accountable for their actions. You violate the law, you have to be held accountable. My problem with the system today is that we over-incarcerate. That there, and I'm not. I wasn't responsible for that as a police commissioner. There's a difference between a prison and a jail. Rikers Island, I had 133,000 inmate admissions a year, but our average length of stay was 45 to 54 days at the time. You're not rehabilitating in that system. There's not much you can do. The bottom line is, in prison systems, you can incentivize good time. You can get people out faster. You can reduce the head count. An enormous. Today, you have over 23,000 men in minimum security camps in the federal prison system. They're there in a camp that has no fence, that has no locks, that's unsecured. It's there, basically, you're there on an honor system. There was no fence around the camp I was at. I could walk outside and take off anytime I wanted to. You're going to get arrested and be brought back, but you're there based on your own honor. If you could be there, why can't you be on home confinement, working, paying taxes, taking care of your family, taking care of your kids, doing community service, making restitution? The system contradicts its own mission statement, and it's doing it overwhelmingly. Norman talked about, you guys talked about restitution. Okay, if you really, really want that guy to make restitution, then allow him to do it. Don't crucify him, annihilate him completely, professionally, personally, and then expect you're going to get paid. You're not getting paid back. He's not paying restitution. He's not going to be able to do it. He can't work. He can't get a job.
Yeah, and we have the numbers on that, by the way. In Texas, probationers pay $50 million in restitution. Prisoners less than $500,000 total in fines, fees, and restitution.
So, I believe are we now going to take audience questions and Twitter questions? Who's going to? I'm going to pass the microphone. Oh, this is from Twitter? Yes. Wonderful. If I can read it, let's see. So these aren't directed at anybody in particular. So are there any actions or behaviors that are undercriminalized or perhaps underpenalized?
Not in this country.
Not in this country.
That's a good question.
What have we left? What's left to criminalize?
It's the there ought to be a law sort of.
Well, yeah, okay. So that's actually a good point that we can jump off of. I mean, why does this happen? It happens almost always because of hysterical reactions and because politicians jump in. You take any high visibility case, and some bad law is going to come out of it. Some bad criminal law is going to come out of it. Whether it's high visibility murder or something like that, an accident, a plant thing, whatever it is, it's going to lead to it the reason is because it gives the politician has the allure of the illusion of doing something. When something happens, you say, like, I love this example because it's so classic. A couple of years ago, there was a tremendous tragedy in New York, where I'm from, where a casino bus driver had an accident. He fell asleep at the wheel, and a number of people were killed. It's a terrible tragedy. The man wasn't drinking. He wasn't taking drugs. He had a perfect driving record. And yet they prosecuted him on 11 or whatever counts of manslaughter. And he was acquitted. He was acquitted because, guess what? Accidents happen. People sometimes die as a result of those accidents. But that's not criminal. And the jury figured it out, and they acquitted him. So what did we get then? We got a spate of driving while drowsy laws. Many proposed, some actually enacted, that make it a strict liability offense that if they can prove that you had an accident and you hadn't slept for 24 hours, you've committed a crime. Well, think about the people who sometimes have to drive. Police officers, firemen, medical people who work these ridiculous shifts and have families to support. This is how it happens in our society. We've got to turn that back, and we've got to think about, what kind of a country do we want to be, and are we going to allow people to get on with their lives and not face this fear of prosecution?
Well, and it's a one-way ratchet. I think the ABA or one of these groups has an essay contest, there shall be a law. And, of course, we need one, there shall not be a law. But, again, it's what you said with these boutique crimes. If every problem, is if all you have is a hammer, every problem's a nail. That's pretty much legislators make law. And so it's almost impossible to repeal. And so one of the ideas we're trying to move forward is kind of a military-based closure commission model where, because prosecutors even agree that many of these laws are duplicative, overlapping. And, in fact, the lobbyists for the Texas prosecutors have said this actually makes their job more difficult. And he has pointed out that it often gives businesses, because some of these criminal laws were one business trying to put another out of business. And he said that gives them a free government lawyer when this matter should be civil, if it's even not to be left to the free market, which would largely be the preference, I think. So, this actually is consuming the time of prosecutors who should be obviously focusing on crimes that involve harm to another human being.
And this one is another one for anybody. Might criminal justice reform mean more private investment or investment in work release or transitional housing programs? Is that one solution?
I personally, I guess there's two parts to that. I think the one part, I'm not for privatization, getting involved in that, because I think it becomes more of a business. So I think, personally speaking, I think that you want to see these programs that are run by governmental entities, so that it doesn't become an unreasonable incentive to put people in the programs that are run. I think there's some things that you just don't do as a society. You don't encourage people who are elderly and or people who are being confined to become a tool of a financial circumstance. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have a problem in the system that we do now, because there's so much money involved in the system. We see that, in Texas, we have cities that want to have new prisons. So they come and ask for the next prison to be built there. We finally cut back and shut down a prison in Texas, and it took a long time for that to happen, but it's become such a big complex, and it's a moneymaker, and you have a city that has difficult jobs, and people want to have a prison industry come in. But now, as to the aspect in terms of what we would see, I think that we can see that a number of the crimes shouldn't be criminal. And I think that's one of the things. There needs to be massive reform of the penal code and all the criminal laws and all the other codes to try to take some of them out of the penal code. Number two, like the smart sentencing law that we have on the federal side, I think we need to have an assessment done so you can do things like Judge Gilmore and look at circumstances, maybe not criminalize individuals who don't need to be criminalized. Because, like Chief Carrick is saying, when you got someone there, they made a mistake on a mortgage application, they had a clean record otherwise, but they're sitting there in prison, so their families are being harmed, and who's really benefiting from that? No one really and truly is benefiting from that. So I think that we're going to see more programs like that. That we'll see more programs where individuals are allowed to go into society and live in homes and to actually become part of society, actually pay taxes and do things of that nature. That's what we would like to see, something that is more holistic and take a holistic approach when you look at punishment, and you're not just cold-hearted like the judge that we saw in that East Texas county that simply said, no, you made a mistake. I know one thing we see in Texas is that in the past we've had so many people just for financial reasons. You couldn't make a payment on your probation, so you get yanked. I think that's absurd. People in difficult circumstances, they may not have the means to do it, but you have the authority and the latitude to just say, you didn't pay, I'm going to put you in prison. So everybody is harmed by that. So I think when we get a number of people together, you come up with all the ideas and minds, but those thoughts are thoughts that I would like to see implemented to the extent that we don't privatize them too much to put an unreasonable or unwarranted incentive there.
Andrew, I just want to touch on the privatization thing for 1 second, because this is an $80 billion a year industry. Correction. The prison system. Okay? $80 billion across the board. 2 years ago, a private correction company sent a letter to a number of states, and basically what they wanted, they said, we will take your state prisoners, we will take control of your system, and we will do it cheaper than you do for a much less cost with two guarantees. One, that it's a 20-year contract. Two, that you guarantee us a 90% occupancy rate. Now, I have to tell you, and this is true, what I'm telling you. If I was running Rikers and signed a contract like that, I could promise you I would have to do many, many things illegally to meet the contract. I'd have to make sure that people got violated. I'd have to make sure that they got no incentivized good time. I'd have to make sure I did everything physically in my power to keep those facilities packed, to guarantee me a 90% occupancy rate. Who in the world can guarantee in 4 years from now, in 6, 8, 12 years from today, I'm going to have a 90% occupancy rate in a facility? How are you going to sign a contract like that? But there are states that are seriously considering privatizing under those conditions. It's insane.
And let me just add to that, because Chief, that's an astounding point. And there are entities in this state that have contracts that do require certain percentages to be incarcerated in handling those contracts. So I don't remember if it's 90% or not, but that's something that has actually happened.
I totally agree with you that those arrangements are just flat out wrong. Now, TDCJ does not have any contracts like that. In fact, they can back up their truck to any private facility that contracts with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice.
TDCJ is the
Texas Department of Criminal Justice. They can pull those inmates out anytime they want. And in fact, some of the prisons that we closed 3 adult prisons, and 2 of those were private state jails. One of them was a public, government-run prison. So I think one of the big problems is how do you, for example, there's a great role to have, nonprofits, I think we would all agree, running treatment programs in prisons, mentoring programs, often better than the government could do it. The key is, not just, first of all, don't incentivize incarceration, don't guarantee occupancy rates, that's obvious, but also don't just have a flat per diem, but have an incentive for reducing recidivism, pay in large measure based on results. And frankly, then you could actually take advantage of what the private sector is good at, which is innovating. Instead, what these private prison contracts say is you have to have the same key system, the teachers have to have the same days off as the state prison system, and you might save a little bit of money on pensions, and that's there's something to be said for that, but you're not really encouraging innovation because it's not being done in a market-driven way.
I think I'd like to just comment and say that we have to look creatively at how to change our approach to this. We had testimony in our hearings in East Palo Alto, which was at one point known as, I guess, the murder capital of the country, the police department took a different approach. Instead of trying to violate everybody, they developed a number of programs to try to get people jobs, to get them working, to provide daycare, and suddenly the murder rate dropped, the recidivism rate dropped. So we have to look at creative things like that. And on this whole issue of privatization, look, the worst scandal, the most disgraceful thing you can think of is the Kids for Cash scandal that happened in Pennsylvania, where they were basically steering kids, juveniles, into this lockup. And you know, it ended up in a tremendous scandal. I mean, there are some places where you have to say, no, privatization isn't right. We wouldn't privatize the national defense of the country. We shouldn't privatize incarceration or the criminal justice system. Do private entities have a role to play in helping? Sure. But you can't put a profit motive in locking people up, because if you do that, you wind up with what we have, which is mass incarceration.
So here's another Twitter question that actually relates to that. With crime rates as low as the late 60s, especially violent crimes have been declining for the last several decades, what's the prospect of cutting prison populations to the level of that time? Seems like a paradox now. Anybody have?
Well, of course, as I think folks here know, the last few years we've seen slight declines in the incarceration rate, more than slight in Texas, I'm proud to say, over double-digit decline. At the same time, our rates of crime have declined double-digit and more than the national crime decline. So, first of all, we've been able to demonstrate, not just in Texas, but in dozens of states around the country, that you can reduce both incarceration and crime at the same time. And I think as the public and as policymakers see that, they're willing to take the next steps. Now you're standing at the diving board and the water doesn't look so cold. We can keep reducing incarceration. The key, I think, is, and this is something we have pushed back on against some, frankly, some of the liberal politicians in California and Oregon who are supporting reforms there, criminal justice reforms to reduce incarceration, which was great, but they wanted to take the money that was saved and put it towards social programs for other, to grow government in other areas. And what we were saying is, look, you've got to take at least some of that money and reinvest it in public safety, into law enforcement approaches, the data-driven policing, the things you did in New York. You can actually deter crime. When you have police in hot spots on the street, the studies show you've got fewer auto burglaries and all sorts of other crimes. And of course, the things we need to do with probation, treatment, drug courts, the people that aren't going to prison that need some other alternative to hold them accountable. You know, part of the problem is you've got this spectrum where you have probation as a couple dollars a day and prison at $50 a day. And a lot of what we've been doing is filling in that spectrum with things like drug courts or electronic monitoring that might be $8 a day. And so you've got to send some of that money back to do those things. And of course, I might use the rest to cut taxes, but we can all figure that out later.
I want to see the question in the microphone.
So I've heard a lot of amazing statistics here. I mean, I think one of the most persuasive things, though, on this panel is having Commissioner Carrick here, who is a person whose story is incredibly persuasive of that show me the man and I'll show you the crime kind of Stalinistic place where we find ourselves. How are you guys finding more stories like that where individual Americans can see themselves as potential victims of this and maybe relate a little bit more and care a little bit more?
I think this goes back to what Gary said earlier. A lot of this is about educating the American public. If you don't know it exists, if you don't have some personal discourse, if you haven't seen it on your own, if you don't have a friend or a family member that's gone through it, you don't know. And if you don't know, you don't care. And if you don't care, you're not going to do anything about it. Listen, I've done this for 30 years. I've been in this business for 30 years. I was an extremely aggressive cop. I was very good at what I did. I had some of the greatest success rates in correctional reforms in this country's history. And I did not know that the system worked the way it does. If I didn't know, I promise you, the American people don't know, and many of those legislators don't know. And as long as they don't know, if they saw what I saw, if they witnessed what I witnessed, and they felt what I have, there would be anger, there would be outrage, and there would be change. The key is to educate the American people and let them know what the realities are, where the flaws, where the failures are, and how we can do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's something
I would say, Andrew, the solution starts with you. The media has a big role to play
Fair enough,
here.
yes.
The media has a big role to play here. I completely agree with what Commissioner just said. There's a big disconnect between the reality of our criminal justice system and what the people think. And it isn't until it hits home, when it's a friend, a neighbor, a relative, that they really understand it. And my experience before I was at NACDL is as a criminal defense lawyer for 20 some odd.
Some pretty bizarre things
I
criminalized.
defended everything, and from double homicide to drinking in public. But the thing that always struck me as most shocking was the fact that the public did not understand the serious consequences. Most people still think that you can it'll be a slap on the wrist, you can get probation. We're just beginning to break through that myth that nobody goes to jail. And that's what's happening. That's why we're beginning to see progress. I think that's why you're seeing all these different folks on this panel, because the country is waking up to what we've created. And that's a hopeful sign. And there are a lot of things that we can do to build on that emerging awareness. But I do think the media has a role to play. It's hard to resist, just like the politicians can't resist. When you've got a juicy case and, you want to, I'm not talking about you personally, but it's what makes people tune in at night. And, those shows they go with the sensational.
The sad thing, though, is that a lot of these stories, I mean, Commissioner Carrick brings up the story about somebody who was put in jail for selling a whale tooth on eBay as a story. I mean, these stories seem like they're salacious enough where the media could pick up on them and make them into really good human interest stories. Or also the racial disparity. I mean, that is something the media should eat up. I mean, Stop and Frisk in New York became this big media circus, but for some reason it just doesn't. There seems to be a disconnect why it doesn't become it doesn't hit everybody at home necessarily.
Let me mention one thing about, I think Judge Gilmore, I think the question related in some ways to identifying other individuals who have been victimized in this manner. And one of the things that Judge Gilmore talks about when you hear her talk, and I think she's even written a book on this, is the letters she gets that she can't act upon, that she gets from children who are being sentenced. So, you just going to a sentencing hearing and seeing the family members and people who were there, or being able to go through a sentencing file and identifying the individuals who were impacted or negatively affected. And I think one of the things that in the book that Judge Gilmore did, she did it with a psychiatrist. And because the psychiatrist apparently specialized in children of incarcerated parents. And the stories and the impacts on those children are just pretty astounding if you look at it. So I think there's a resource of there that individuals who may be willing to come forward and to tell their story, and then there are indeed many people who have just been victimized. And you look at this situation. We had in Texas, we had a guy a few years ago in Houston that got 40 years for one joint. And Chief, that just was one of the most unbelievable things that I've ever seen. It's 40. That's not an exaggeration. 40 years for one joint, and so you have an incredible system. That allows people to be victimized in circumstances like that. So I think we can identify them, and I think that people can bond with them, because I think all of us have had loved ones who've been victimized in the system that way. I don't think anyone, I don't care how wealthy or what side of town you come from, I think we can all relate to this issue. We just need to be able to get the people to be put out front to maybe hopefully get more of a connection, because I think Mark has a point that we have grown some, but I'm not where he is. I don't think we've grown to the extent that we need to. And we've lost some really good people recently in the legislature. So I don't think the landscape is where it needs to be.
Some varying. You have time for one more question? One more. I don't want to cut everybody off.
This question's for Norman. I'd like to preface it with the fact that I have many friends whose lives and educational prospects have been completely derailed over less than 3.5 grams of marijuana. You made the statement that people, namely criminals, can change and grow. I agree. However, do you think there are types of nonviolent offenders, namely sex offenders, who cannot be rehabilitated, or whose rehabilitation and reintegration into society is not worth the risk of the crime they may or may not commit? And if so, how do we objectively differentiate between these types of nonviolent offenders?
Well, first of all, if you're talking about, I don't necessarily consider sex offenders to be nonviolent. So I think you have to take those and treat them differently. On the question, and this is a very sensitive question, and the task force that we had that did this study, we grappled very long and hard with the whole issue of sexual registration and those issues. Because the fact of the matter is that there is probably a very, very small subset of individuals who are in danger of recidivating in that area. But we have painted with such a broad brush, okay? There are all different kinds of things that get lumped as sex offenses. Like I mentioned public urination, but there are other kinds of offenses that do not involve predators. It do not involve child, abusive acts towards children. But we sweep them all together, and we have created, quite frankly, one of the things that we heard most tellingly about were these horror stories of people who couldn't live anywhere because they were barred from living, or or the registration made it impossible for them to work and get on with their lives. We have to, if we're going to do things like that, even in the very hot-button area of sex offenses, we have to be much more intelligent and selective about it, because otherwise it's totally unfair, and it disables people who have no risk at all. In fact, we had testimony from the district attorney from Alameda County, who actually is on or chairs the sexual management board, or whatever it's called in California. And she was upset with the way they were dealing with things, because you have these residency restrictions and where people can live, and yet statistically most of these abusive things happen within the family. So what sense does it make to block out whole areas where people can't live? And we heard another situation in Florida where people literally, the only place they could live in certain communities was under a tunnel, under a train trestle. Because they couldn't, that's no way for a civilized society to deal with even a serious problem like that. So I don't know if that answers the question about people whose lives have been ruined for minor drug offenses. I just have to say this about, we're getting very close to the point in this country where we really do have to have a national conversation about whether or not the criminalization of controlled substances is the right way to go. 100 years ago, we were at the beginning of Prohibition. At that time, by the way, cocaine was legal. Here we are.
Well, and I'll just say on the issue of sex offenders, one of the bills we worked on last session, which had almost no votes against it, was removing the employer's name and address from the sex offender registry. And we must have gotten 100 notes in the mail, handwritten from family members. And what was happening is, look, the employer didn't commit a sex offense, and here they are potentially being exposed to vigilantism or whatnot because they've given somebody a second chance. And of course, virtually no sex offenses actually occur in the workplace. So it's very important that we use kind of a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer, and not the least restrictive alternative to satisfy public safety. And I think that's what we all agree on.
Unfortunately, there are so many things we could talk about, but we are out of time. Sadly, there are literally thousands of other facets we can talk about here. But thank you, everybody, for watching at home, and thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you to the panelists for amazing
Are you publishing much on this? Because really, you got a hell of a story.